The official report contained all my work but omitted my identity entirely. Maya Ellison. That's who I am. At 33, I occupied that precarious middle ground, beyond the naive enthusiasm of youth, yet lacking the institutional weight that makes one indispensable. My job description read Senior Systems Developer, though in reality, I served as the emergency contact when critical infrastructure threatened to collapse under unexpected strain. I wasn't the public face representing our initiatives or the polished speaker at community forums. Boardroom presentations weren't my forte. I lacked the proper attire and the skill of condensing complex ideas into digestible talking points. But when systems failed, I knew how to rebuild them. My requests were modest until the day I finally asked for recognition that was rightfully mine. 6 years with the company, I joined during the era of manual deployments and whimsically named servers borrowed from animated characters. Those early days saw 23 of us crammed into dual floors, coding with desperate intensity. My first major contribution remains vivid, identifying a critical memory leak buried deep within a system everyone else avoided. That discovery launched my career trajectory. 2 quiet promotions followed. I deliberately avoided team leadership roles, not from inability, but from preference. The profound focus required for deep architectural work creates a unique rhythm that vanishes once you climb the management ladder. I chose to remain close to the foundation. By year 4, I was the sole surviving original engineer still working directly with core infrastructure. When the East Coast server clusters began failing under heavy traffic loads that winter, customers flooded us with complaints about timeouts, incomplete transactions, and failed confirmations. Leadership proposed expensive caching solutions while I requested raw traffic analytics. Working unpaid overtime for 2 weeks, I completely reconstructed our internal routing architecture by hand, mapping every performance bottleneck and rewriting our traffic management protocols. The new deployment went live 3 weeks later. System latency plummeted by 87%, uptime stabilized completely, and customer complaints virtually disappeared. Finance projected annual savings of $26.4 million from reduced downtime and improved efficiency. Marketing labeled it structural maturity, while executive presentations called it adaptive architecture. Nobody attributed it to me. I didn't escalate or defend my contribution through email campaigns, trusting the results would speak for themselves. But Richard Vail, our recently appointed CTO, had already crafted his narrative. He transformed my data into polished presentations about engineering evolution and flew to San Francisco to present it as executive leadership success. From my workstation, I watched the live stream with one browser tab while monitoring the codebase in another. When I requested a salary increase 2 weeks later, I arrived prepared with comprehensive documentation, charts, logs, and version histories. I scheduled the meeting personally, prepared printed materials, and presented my case directly. He glanced at the first few pages, nodded with the patronizing air of someone humoring a junior employee, and delivered his verdict. "You're dependable, Maya. But leadership requires presence, and presence transcends mere numbers." Then he checked his watch. The numbers weren't the only things that endured. Buried within a rarely accessed file lay a single comment I'd written 18 months prior, 3 words, a timestamp, and my initials in lowercase. Quiet and deliberate, I typed it reflexively as a reminder of what had been fixed and why. During Richard's presentation, that comment appeared on screen. The livestream camera captured it when he opened the actual routing diagram, clicking through the logic tree I had constructed. One slide lingered longer than others. The code appeared cleaner now, reformatted by someone else, but my comment remained unchanged. He hadn't noticed it, hadn't erased it, yet there it sat, projected 10 feet high behind him as he spoke of collaborative evolution and cross-functional breakthroughs. He never mentioned the weekend rebuild, the architect who created the system he now described as a team effort driven by alignment. That moment wasn't betrayal, it was confirmation. Following that revelation, I began documenting everything. Then came my reassignment, not termination or disciplinary action, just quiet relocation. My name disappeared from the system architecture group, calendar invitations stopped arriving, and my new title came without roadmap, team, or explanation. They simply transferred me to compliance testing, cutting my access without ceremony. If you're reading this during your lunch break or on your way out like I just did, leave some trace. Tell me where you're listening from, not for my sake, but for the record. Every system maintains one, and every system remembers more than it reveals. That evening, I accessed archived logs from our first successful deployment. The markers, logic flows, and decision trails no one else had examined were all preserved. In one corner, I found a note I'd left myself in a section that hadn't required review in over a year. Not a signature, just documentation of what I'd fixed. They never erased it. They simply stopped looking. The next morning, I stopped waiting and started recording. Not screenshots for revenge, just documentation. Simple and silent. I downloaded historical build reports and version logs, not for immediate use, but knowing they wouldn't remain online indefinitely. I traced project tickets marked closed without comment and preserved every architectural file bearing my digital fingerprints. When someone modifies your work while leaving your signature intact, it's either carelessness or confidence. I couldn't determine which characterized Richard, but I knew he'd stopped examining the foundations. He treated results as if they materialized fully formed rather than being built under pressure, maintaining eye contact when discussing vision but looking away when asked about implementation details. In my new role, I maintained low visibility. The team I'd trained now participated in roadmap discussions. Projects I'd led no longer bore my name. I arrived punctually, departed on schedule, smiled in elevators, and answered questions with just enough detail to appear cooperative. But each evening, I accessed the archive testing environment I'd cloned months earlier, built for internal testing but never fully decommissioned. I used it to compare logs, not for sabotage or leverage, but to understand what remained active and what had changed. My findings were revealing. They hadn't rebuilt anything. The logic tree, redirect framework, and adaptive timing model all remained operational. Every live instance followed my routing paths. Every error trigger activated my fallback systems. The entire structure stood because nobody dared modify what they didn't fully comprehend, yet they claimed ownership. In compliance testing, I received requests to verify new modules from engineers I'd once trained. They submitted mock-ups, diagrams, and stability analyses, but their reference base remained constant, my original architecture, now labeled legacy. I never corrected them, because attribution mattered less than understanding. Deep within that system, beneath new layers and behind renamed tags, my original markers persisted, commented, indexed, untouched. They hadn't erased me. They'd simply stopped speaking my name aloud. Nobody questioned my extended hours in the new role. My calendar remained empty, meetings had ceased, and hallway glances became brief nods followed by silence. There was a time when I filled white bars and product managers awaited my approval before finalizing deliveries. That era had passed, but the system endured, still running on my architecture, while few understood it completely. They used it, built upon it, and spoke around it without truly seeing it. When people stop examining what supports their structure, they assume it will never shift. That assumption created the opportunity one exploited. I started small with a debugging tool, nothing innovative or risky, just a utility pitched quietly to the infrastructure team. It provided real-time load snapshots across regions and visualized performance trends without accessing core logs. Non-invasive, lightweight, completely safe. Approval came within 2 days with Richard responding simply, useful. It was more than useful, it was strategic. Within the module, I embedded a signal, not a backdoor or a trap, just a quiet echo triggered when the system accessed specific branches of my routing logic. Each activation confirmed they were still dependent on my foundation. I collected no user data or sensitive information, tracking only structural dependencies, how frequently the system needed my logic, and how deep that reliance ran. Initially, signals arrived sporadically during midday spikes and evening transitions. Then patterns emerged, late nights, peak campaigns, holiday traffic. Every demand surge illuminated my routing framework again, quietly, predictably, relentlessly. They called it a debug tool. I called it evidence. The system didn't lie. It pulsed, repeated, and called my name without recognition. My monitor remained simple. One black window with white bars marking trigger locations, timestamps, and load patterns. After 1 month, the bars exceeded single-screen capacity. Usage had grown not just in traffic but in reliance. They hadn't rewritten anything, merely expanded the load without reinforcing the foundation. Like old buildings in historic cities, renovated, painted, rebranded, but with unchanged underlying wiring. If nobody maps those wires again, they learn through failure what still carries the current. Each evening I reviewed signal logs, not gathering ammunition but measuring structural weight. Before removing a pillar, you must understand the consequences of its absence. The main repository never yielded what I needed. It was the abandoned one nobody monitored. Every engineer maintains a graveyard, folders buried too deep, projects renamed multiple times, directories with timestamps from forgotten years. Ours was labeled infrastructure_legacy_archive, too vague for flagging, too old for purging. Hidden behind 2 redirects and an outdated security wall, it remained accessible without approvals, audit trails, or download limits. Inside lay everything: old builds, comment threads, test logs from my first staging runs. Deployment scripts retained original timestamps, changelogs listed initial rollback attempts, crash reports and validation tables documented my nocturnal coding sessions. But the code mattered less than the metadata. Each file carried my identifier, account tag, creation time, and execution hash, all uncorrected, unclaimed, untouched. One internal design specification from the pre-release phase contained my notes attached directly to the architecture proposal. Though never forwarded to product teams or included in formal release documentation, its content matched our eventual deployment exactly. They hadn't removed me from the record. They'd simply begun a new one version later. I preserved everything, not from fear or planned usage, but from the realization of what they'd forgotten. Ownership isn't always documented in paperwork. Sometimes it exists in patterns, fingerprints, and trails nobody else bothered to erase. Richard always emphasized that what matters is the system that runs. He was more correct than he realized. He appreciated streamlined processes, smooth deployments, and assured presentations, yet never inquired about who remained to handle the cleanup afterward. When the team departed from the strategy room, he avoided examining the foundational documents. He failed to follow the trail linking the announcements to the actual workforce. I took that responsibility. Later that evening, I transferred the complete directory into a protected environment. I implemented encryption not to conceal information, but because I had created something valuable enough to safeguard. I composed a brief summary, not for legal proceedings or public writing, simply for documentation. Then I established one principle: view-only access. No modifications. No change tracking. This wasn't intimidation. It was reflection. I knew eventually someone would question the Foundation's authorship, and I wanted that answer available without excuse or distraction. Simply facts maintained quietly in the repository they neglected to secure. The incident began not with system failure, but with quietude. Monday's typical rush of system analytics, team briefings, and partially reviewed product summaries proceeded normally. However, something in the status channel seemed altered.
Brief et discussion.
No latency increases from Sector 7. No traffic drift on the eastern pathway. The infrastructure maintained stability. Perhaps too much stability. Then I discovered the notification. It was concealed 2 layers within the infrastructure communications. Customer reference A91B has transitioned away. System integration finalized. There was no formal announcement or deliberation. Simply a discrete notation labeled resolved. That customer had been among our pioneers, a supply chain operation with regional presence spanning 6 states. Their operations relied heavily on our scheduling system. They had invested 2 years modifying their transaction processes to align with our routing framework. Their achievement narrative had previously appeared on a presentation slide Richard displayed at an international conference. Now, without ceremony, they had departed. No system failure, no conflict. They had simply moved on. I observed our team's reaction. Engineers confirmed the ticket. Several inquiries emerged. Did they provide reasons? Was pricing the issue? Did we overlook something in customer service? The responses remained unclear. One person mentioned vendor evaluation. Another referenced leadership changes on their end. Nobody linked it to system design. Yet I identified the trend. That customer had been the initial tester of our platform when the routing framework launched. I recalled their integration records. They were first to stress test our system under full regional capacity. Now, they were first to migrate to an alternative provider. I examined the new provider's website. Their back-end architecture wasn't publicly visible, but I could discern enough. Cross-region redundancy, intelligent load distribution, schedule-based capacity management. It appeared recognizable. Not identical, not duplicated, but influenced. Remnants of a logical structure I understood intimately. Someone had analyzed my creation and developed their own version. I closed the browser. This wasn't sabotage or theft. This was the consequence when teams build without consideration, presuming the foundation would remain solid forever. Then someone else arrives offering a system they can actually comprehend. That week brought additional indicators. The diagnostic tool I had implemented months prior revealed a decline, not in volume, but in connection frequency. Fewer requests to the central logic, reduced dependency on the routing framework. Not because they had substituted it, but because certain areas were no longer accessing it. Not usage reduction, usage redistribution. They continued using my system, but it was no longer the exclusive option available. I remained silent about this. There was nothing to discuss. Nobody had observed the change. Even if they had, they would have characterized it as strategic customer diversification. They wouldn't address the more challenging question: what occurs when the architecture you depend upon becomes discretionary? I understood the outcome. You cease noticing the framework until it disappears. You stop questioning who constructed it until nobody can repair it. Then you label it disruption, despite it beginning as a murmur. Just one customer, one departure. Sometimes the first to leave doesn't create the loudest disturbance. They simply unlock the initial exit. The correspondence arrived without fanfare, through legal channels. Late Thursday afternoon, a single email to 5 recipients. Subject: Intellectual Property Review. Request urgent. The sender represented a firm I recognized, though others seemed unfamiliar. Professional name, corporate logo, discreet reputation for precision regarding corporate ownership rights. They weren't requesting access, they were providing notification. Attached was a formal complaint, 36 pages, signed and documented. It referenced timestamps, deployment histories, source origins. It detailed a claim that a recently acquired and registered patent under a new technology consortium was being utilized within our infrastructure without permission. The disputed code wasn't explicitly identified, but I recognized the terminology. Weighted traffic channels. Recursive logic structures. Conditional branch optimization. This was my work. I didn't need to continue reading to understand what had occurred. 3 weeks earlier, I had transferred my rights, not to litigation, but to a corporation that had contacted me through legal representation after reviewing my open-source contributions under an alternate identity. They posed appropriate questions, not about my creation, but about timing, not about ownership, but about authorship. After verification concluded, they asked one question: would you consider transferring the patent? No coercion, no intimidation, just a clear, professional proposal with genuine terms and transparent language. I agreed because, by then, I didn't need to possess the innovation. I simply needed to stop pretending it belonged elsewhere. Now, watching the executive team review the cease and desist letter, I witnessed the transformation occur immediately. It wasn't fear, not initially. It was something more gradual, bewilderment meeting rejection. Richard was in the corridor when the message surfaced. He entered the conference room 10 minutes later with a printed copy and eyes that no longer moved naturally. "This is a misunderstanding," he stated. "We've developed all our essential systems internally." But I noticed it. The hesitation, how his fingers pressed slightly against the document's edge, how his voice extended the word, essential, longer than usual. He didn't believe it. He just needed others to accept it. The response came within 2 days. The new patent holder wasn't seeking compensation, not yet. They wanted clarification, audit trails, architectural diagrams, explanation of how something developed after the filing date could contain functions drafted 6 months earlier within our system. Richard scheduled a private meeting. I wasn't included, but attendance wasn't necessary. I already knew their discussion points, phrases like shared inspiration and parallel development. The defensive language used when you cannot prove your creation but still want to claim it. I accessed the monitoring system. It continued operating. The signals hadn't ceased. Every region, every level, every active deployment still accessed the logic, still depended on the foundation. I closed the interface, not because I wanted to avoid seeing it, but because monitoring was unnecessary. This wasn't litigation about money. It was a statement. The system they had constructed wasn't entirely theirs, and now someone else possessed documentation proving it. Not me, not anymore. The directive came 2 days after the legal notice. Restructure the system. Remove the vulnerable components. Replace the disputed logic before the next development cycle. Theoretically, it seemed straightforward. Practically, it was entirely different. Richard called it an architectural refresh. He addressed the company-wide meeting with the tone of someone explaining a weather delay. Unfortunate, temporary, manageable. Behind him, the whiteboard displayed arrows, process diagrams, a new acronym I hadn't encountered, but none addressed the core, because none of them could. The routing system was no longer modular. It hadn't been for years. It was the backbone. Every product division, every customer-facing application, every background operation passed through what I had constructed. It wasn't visible, that was the issue. It had functioned too effectively, too silently, for too long. Now they wanted to rebuild it completely, without affecting it. They termed it a precaution. I considered it impossible. Engineers were reassigned from other teams. External contractors were hired. There were sessions, planning meetings, late-night food deliveries in rooms where nobody remembered the original logic's rationale. I passed by quietly. Nobody sought my input, that remained consistent. But I saw exhaustion in their expressions. I recognized it, the same weariness I had carried initially when I maintained the system single-handedly while watching leadership market the results. Only now they lacked a system, they had a deadline. Someone attempted to recreate the logic structure. I found the draft on a printer one morning. 6 pages of confidence, reminiscent of initial diagrams people create before encountering real data. Later that day, someone manually rerouted a region. The system faltered. Nothing completely failed, but processing time increased 48% in 39 seconds. I watched the performance spike and gradually stabilize, more slowly this time. The update was reversed by lunch. In one meeting, I heard someone use the phrase, acceptable degradation. That's when I knew it had begun. Not the reconstruction, but the deterioration. When you permit such terminology to remain unchallenged in a room of developers, you're no longer enhancing the system, you're managing its decline. They were doing this in real time, while clients waited and competitors observed. That week, I noticed something else. An old system discussion thread reopened, dated from my original implementation, long before anyone labeled it critical. Someone had added a question. Do we have clear ownership here? No response came. By Friday, the thread was deleted. The code remained, as did the silence. The message arrived without a subject line, just a name I hadn't heard directly from Richard since the initial reassignments, since the last time he explained architecture to people who had never written migration procedures. He previously spoke with conviction, always gesturing, always drawing on someone else's whiteboard. This time he didn't send a meeting invitation, just a request for private discussion. The corridor outside my workspace was quiet that day. I could hear someone erasing a whiteboard 2 rooms away, the silence that follows too many meetings with insufficient answers. He stopped by late afternoon without a team, laptop, or charts, just a folded page and the burden of unspoken words. He stood across from me briefly, neither speaking nor asking. I watched him glance at the open file on my screen and left it visible. License documentation, patent transfer timestamped 8 weeks prior. It wasn't a threat, it was proof. He didn't sit, just stood as if awaiting an opportunity that no longer existed. I didn't provide one. I had already given them my structure. They had called it adaptable, treated it as replaceable until it wasn't. Now, standing within a building powered by something they didn't fully comprehend, he was trying to recall what they had overlooked. He eventually spoke, not loudly or authoritatively, but with the voice of someone no longer defending a position, only attempting to slow the decline. I let him finish, then handed him the document, a single copy of the ownership record, clear, dated, binding. He read it once, nodded, and asked nothing further. As he turned to leave, I caught his reflection in the glass beside my desk. His posture wasn't defensive, it was incomplete. I remained long after the lights switched to evening mode. The routing system continued pulsing in the background, same pathways, same fallbacks, same architecture they couldn't rewrite. Not because the code was complex, but because the logic had been invisible too long. Now that they needed it to respond, they had no method to call it back. Nobody commented when I stopped accessing the internal console. No farewell announcement or memo, just an absence that settled quietly across the access logs. Another credential deactivated, another account marked inactive in a system still dependent on its identifier. I didn't leave in frustration. I had already departed long before the lawsuits, before the whiteboard redesigns and overnight emergency rewrites. My departure wasn't marked by resignation, it was marked by detachment. I stopped being the architect when they began treating architecture like ornamentation. But the structure remained even after I withdrew my authorization. The system continued reflecting my decisions. The routing model still responded to pressure as I had designed it. The backup pathways still activated in the sequence I had written 2 winters earlier. Even stripped of attribution and presence, the logic persisted. That was the component they couldn't remove, not due to legal risk, but due to dependence. By month's end, their reconstruction efforts were quietly delayed. Internal tickets were marked low-priority refactoring. Timelines were obscured in the shared roadmap. Several engineers departed. Others moved to surface-level projects. What was once considered outdated had become essential, and what was once background had become central. I didn't intervene or remind them of the code's capabilities. I had nothing left to demonstrate. Instead, I built something new, not a replacement or duplicate, but a fresh beginning. I invested 2 weeks structuring the initial release, not for speed or publicity, just accuracy. I took the logic I believed in, the version before it was compromised, extended, or claimed, and rewrote it with clarity. Each function documented, each pathway mapped in the kind of structure that encourages others to learn, not merely use. Then I released it. Open access, attribution required, no paywall or confidentiality agreement. Just terms making one thing clear. This work has an author, and this time the author remains. I didn't advertise it, but the platform discovered it within 72 hours. 3 unknown engineers contributed their first pull request. Within a week, 2 universities inquired about using the system in their advanced infrastructure courses. Quiet messages arrived from people who had worked on similar systems, who had been replaced, overlooked, or edited out, and were now finding their own logic reflected back. The company didn't respond, but I noticed one change. The internal job board removed the listing for principal systems architect. They never filled the position because they finally understood. You can modify the title, rename the files, but you cannot ignore the system still supporting the building, especially when its creator is no longer maintaining it. I didn't erase my original work, I simply rewrote it under my own name. No headline or feature launch, just a version without disguise. Transparent, attributed, precise. I left no room for confusion. The structure stood on clear logic, clear language, and one signature that couldn't be replaced this time. It moved quietly initially, a few engineers found it, then more. Not because it was prominent, but because it functioned as systems should when built without politics. I watched it grow not with acclaim, but with consistency. At the company, the platform I left behind continued operating, not because it was stable, but because they couldn't afford to modify it again. They slowed updates, avoided core changes, tried not to reference the logic by name, but the name had already moved. It now existed in citations and codebases built by people I never met, in small footnotes at the bottom of architecture papers and system design presentations. Eventually, a recruiter contacted me asking if I could explain the routing method I'd published months earlier. They described it as emerging best practice credited to an unfamiliar team. I didn't correct them. I just asked where they had seen it. They sent me a slide. My comment line was still there. This time, nobody had erased it.